Again in 48 hours, the entirety of our year here at Fletcher. So in this iteration, Anastasia is going to talk about unilateral sanctions in a multipolar world, continuing on from her lunch discussion today and two discussions yesterday as well. This is obviously a continuation of a long-running discussion we've been having at Fletcher on different tools in U.S.-Russian relations that are used by the different parties, and so just looking at this new context in increasingly multipolar world, which of course is a world that we're in. So I'm very excited to introduce you yet again. From the floor to you, and then after some comments, we'll open up to discussion later on. So if you have questions, please feel free to brainstorm them and then direct them towards Anastasia once she's finished with her comments. So, floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Chris. If you're not against it, I'd like today concentrate not particularly on U.S.-Russia relations and U.S. sanctions on Russia, but on Russian and other countries' attitudes towards sanctions as an instrument of foreign policy and how it evolves and where it can go. Here you can see the very pretty rare game. It's chess for 3 players. And actually, if we consider that the world moves towards some multipolarity, it means that any country who is really interested in international affairs will have to play not even one tough party with 3 players, but lots of immediate chess games with many partners. So it makes it really different. And if we try to imagine where to put sanctions as an instrument, what kind of bets it should be, it's really pretty curious, and I think that it definitely will evolve from the situation of 90s or 2000 and even like situation in 2010s when we remember sanctions against Iran or recent sanctions on Russia. So just a very good question, how to switch the slides. Perfect. So today I'd like to focus on Russian and Chinese approach to unilateral sanctions, and then to talk about alternative sanction practices. Sanctions here are in quote because actually Russia and China don't really accept the whole concept of unilateral sanctions, but later on we will try to switch from quote option to a normal talk. And then to go to the future of unilateral sanctions in this multipolar world. So, to your opinion, what is in common between these tomatoes, tourists, or Korean pop singers? And we also have some smoked fish and cosmetics and camembert and charter airlines. Just bad system exam. Actually, that's are the tools that Russia and China use to apply their restrictive economic measures. So, pretty the same thing if we try to represent U.S. sanction policy in terms of pictures. It would be OFAC logo, dollar, SWIFT system. So here we deal with completely other stuff. And the first one looks pretty weird. Why? Actually, so big countries rely on tomatoes and wines. But it has some logic, at least, that we, at the center where I work as a Deputy Director, Center for Comprehensive European and International Studies, we decided 2 years ago to investigate how this logic of unilateral sanctions works for Russia and China. And we called it so-called non-Western sanction tradition. We collected a data set with 75 cases since 1991. Obviously, Soviet Union used restrictive economic measures, but it was a completely different story, and we tried to focus on the contemporary period. Most of the cases we collected relates to Ukraine, Baltic states, Turkey, European Union, and US, especially, mostly since 2014. And for China, there are cases of Korea, Mongolia, Philippines, and even the United States. I have first to make a disclaimer that this data set is in progress, that it is a descriptive approach. We tried to sum up conditions for application, estimated effects and conditions for withdrawals, because lots of these cases represent the elements of withdrawal and lifting of sanctions. And in a second disclaimer, I will more focus on Russia. first, because there were much more cases with Russia and China started to apply to the sanction instruments relatively soon, and also because the Chinese part of the case is conducted by our sinologists, and here I represent joint research, but my part was mostly about Russia. So the conceptual framework of our research was about three main pillars. Official non-recognition of unilateral sanctions is represented both in Russia and China. So if you want just to Google Russian sanctions against Ukraine or Turkey or Baltic states, you will be probably biased because either it's a journalist representation of some political declarations, or you will just lose lots of real cases because that particular cases with wine or tomatoes, they were represented in a completely different way in official rhetorics. Of course, Russia and China use restrictive economic instruments that follows political imperatives. So that's for our cases, it was principally important that some economic decision not to import ban was related to political conjuncture and not to some objective real phytosanitary criteria, because sometimes it happens that you can't import something because it's of a bad quality. We try to make it different. And personal sanctions that were pretty and remain pretty popular in Russia are not considered as economic sanctions and as a real tool of foreign policy. That's a very, at least in Russia, it's a very old school practice of non-grata persons, and it doesn't represent some new tradition of foreign policy or bet on unilateral sanctions. That's just the very old trick that is repeated from year to year. So, the first thing we tried to test when we collected this data set was about, are sanctions are really used for foreign policy goals, or they can be used to achieve multi-dimensional goals. For example, when we speak about US sanction policies or European sanction policies, we can admit that sometimes sanctions follow domestic agenda or pretends to be symbolic, or that's the only one thing you can do except going for war, and going for war is too expensive. So in the Russian and Chinese case, it seems that when Russia and China do use sanctions, they really do use it to achieve some foreign policy goals. And particularly speaking about domestic agenda, we didn't find any strong evidence that countries impose sanctions just to react, to show off their population that they do something, or to unify allies. That is pretty popular in European Union. For example, anti-Russian sanctions since 2014, and especially 2014 and 15, followed also the logic of unification of European Union, and especially after Brexit, it became important to show that European Union has something in common in their foreign policy. But I have to say that this hypothesis is supported only when we speak about cases when Russia and China initiated sanctions on its own, not reacted on that. Because if we speak about 2014, when Russia imposed counter-sanctions against European Union and US and other countries, or China reacted on some minor sanctions of its banks related to North Korean case, we can support it, and in this case both countries rely to some pathetic rhetoric about the need to protect national interest in face of non-friendly measures of other countries. Second hypothesis relates to the bet on informal sanctions. While the US tries to formalize and harden sanctions, and CAS is a very good example, and this fall we see the competition of bills from hell, and it seems that this trend will just strengthen regarding the rising role of Congress in the US foreign policy. Russia and China try to keep sanctions mostly informal and very tactical and flexible measures in their foreign policy. Furthermore, even when they do apply sanctions, so politically motivated economic measures, they try to represent them as purely economically motivated or trade routine measures. And sometimes getting the point for jokes, because when for decades Russians get used to eat Baltic smoked fish, and then next day it turns that now it represents a danger for their health, it's ridiculous. But that's a very persistent official rhetoric that even became gave birth to lots of memes and jokes, but still it's someplace. The guy who was the head of this authority that is called Rospotrebnadzor, so he became a real hero of jokes because he had a very, Gennady Onishchenko had a very brilliant capacity to represent this official explanation why that smoked fish or wine or tomatoes are bad with extremely serious face. And well, for some people it became really funny. But again, this hypothesis is supported only in cases when countries are initiators of sanctions. When we speak about preemptive sanctions, this is not in place, and nobody said in 2014 that French camembert represents a danger for health of Russian citizens, but it was banned. As for official rhetoric, Russia and China officially promote the idea that sanctions as a tool of international relations can be imposed only by UN Security Council. Unilateral sanctions are considered as an incorrect notion by its nature. So if we sanction somebody, there should be some supranational authority that can sanction somebody. If we speak about interstate relation, there is no supranational authority except UN Security Council, so you can sanction. You can just impose some restrictive economic measures motivated by your national interest. I would say that it probably could be motivated by the fact that both Russia and China are members of Security Council, but this approach is also widely spread in Latin American countries that are far from being there. If we speak about India or Republic of Korea, we also can find lots of support to this approach. And even in India, when recently there was a big talk that probably India has to impose some sanctions on Sri Lanka, still the major idea was we want to use sanctions as a tool of our foreign policy if they are not imposed by UN Security Council. So here we can see a very persistent position that unifies not only some members of UN Security Council, but in general non-Western states. To illustrate it, just a few words about official position of Russia. In 2014, Russia imposed food embargo and banned some light industry products, and it was widely called counter-sanctions, and even high-ranked officials, they used this word counter-sanctions. But as for official decree, it was a presidential executive order on certain special economic measures to protect the Russian Federation security. In 2018, our State Duma in April and May started to discuss the draft law of counter-sanctions. Even the head of Duma Committee on International Relations and key initiators of this law, they used this word counter-sanctions and were very persistent in it. But it was signed as a federal law on measures or countermeasures to unfriendly actions of the United States of America and other foreign states. So pretty broad definition and persistent logic not to use the word counter-sanctions and even counter-sanctions and sanctions as official rhetorics of Russian Federation. If you take a look on Chinese documents, you won't find any even laws and orders regulating their use of sanctions. So here you can find it in something, but for most of cases it's not even some federal law, it's very routine acts regarding phytosanitary criteria and imposed ban on it. So our third idea was to test why the ban on flexibility is so persistent, why we are so persistent in informal sanctions. Our idea is that when it's easy to impose, it's pretty easy to lift. And recent discussions on the way how cuts can be one day lifted, they stimulate the idea that probably Russia and China make a bet on these informal sanctions because it's much easier for them to keep the freedom for maneuver. And if the situation changes and some tactical goals are achieved, or countries don't see any reason to keep the sanctions in place, if they see that goal can't be achieved, for example, some Chinese sanctions on American companies like Boeing or Lockheed Martin related to arms supply to Taiwan, while both countries still continue to work in the region, and the ban just doesn't mean nothing. And as far as it was not formalized, it was easy to keep the face and go ahead discussing some supplies aboard China. So it's supported in the cases except reactive cases, because as I showed before, here we can see laws and orders, and to lift them you have to keep some argumentation. My favorite case here is Turkey, when Russian aircraft was shot last year. Oh, sorry, the year before. And the public debate was really very intense after that, and for media it was really easy to, like in a few days, the whole rhetorics, the previous rhetorics about Turkey as an ally, Turkey as a strategic partner, etc., that became widely spread in Russian media since 2000s, when the gas pipeline to Turkey was constructed, when we get lots of investments from Turkey, and Turkey remains the very popular tourist destination for our citizens. All that was ruined in a minute, and all the articles and reports about, as we had 10 Russian-Turkish wars, we're going to have the next one, etc., they were immediately in media. And then it turned that in less than a year, of course not because of tomatoes, but because of the moderation of this official rhetorics, the whole discussion on the public discussion on the improvement of Russian-Turkish relations, it was put under to the debate on imports of tomatoes, and after the very, very big negotiations between Erdogan and Putin in Sochi, the key titles in the media wasn't about the solutions for Syria or that kind of things. It was about that Russia lifted the ban on import of tomatoes from Turkey. And I wouldn't say that that was a tomato ban that made some negotiations possible, but the way how that kind of things are used for quick change of the agenda, they really take place. Here are some other examples, not so broad, but still Russia used and regularly applied sanitary restrictions on imports of Moldovan and Georgian wine, Baltic smoked fish, Turkish tomatoes. And here you can see that the Rospotrebnadzor, Russian Consumer Protection Agency, is a really very important sanctioneer. If you try to collect this data set and compare to the US issued sanctions where OFAC or State Department or Department of Trade will be very important place, and especially OFAC, you can see pretty serious mismatch. Why Consumer Protection Agency plays such an important role in Russian foreign policy, but still it does. Even anti-European Union, not only European Union, but mostly European food embargo of 2014. Actually, you can imagine that one day when Russia decided to lift this embargo, it will be pretty easy to do based on the sustainable level of national food security that now allows us to open our markets for import of food from third countries. And it's much easier to explain, to use this criteria than somehow link camembert imports to Minsk agreements. And in China, for example, we can see an interesting example with Korea, when there was a big dispute between China and Korea on US TAD systems. We collected at least 4 evidences of restrictive measures related to operations of Lotte Group in China, to imports of Korean cosmetics, that is pretty popular in China, to concerts of some K-pop singers, and to tourist industry. And actually, for tourist industry, it was the most remarkable because since in 2016, the number of Korean tourists in China was about 4.6 million. In less than a year, it dropped to 2.6 million. Of Chinese tourists in Korea. And how it was achieved? First, for the period of important holidays, charter air flights were cancelled or banned. There was an official call to Chinese tourist operators, and still Chinese tourism is very often organized as a group tourism, to propose at least 1/5 less tours to Korea, and it immediately led to a serious drop of these tours. And of course, not only that measures, but they had a pretty strong immediate effect on Korean industries related to tourism and to services. In Vietnam, in October 2017, there was an APEC summit where they hold a huge negotiations and very important negotiations between China and Korea, and at least 3 agreements were achieved about non-increase of number of tile systems in Korea, about non-triangle military alliance between Korea, Japan, and US, and non-increase of numbers of military exercises. Immediately, Korean cosmetics became good, and tours became on demand, and the number of tourists increased in less than a year to the previous heights. So that kind of thing, and there was not any official explanations why it happened, how we consider the new level of relations, no symbolic rhetoric at all. Hypothesis number 4 relates to the most favorable tools of non-Western and Western sanctions. If we take a look on US and the European practice, we can see mostly the rising bet on finance and tech imports. Technology relates not only to some special imports, but also joint research, exchange of information, and dual-use supplies. If we take a look on Chinese or Russian sanctions, it's mostly about goods and services. And we can say that it's a pretty strong trend, and non-Western countries use more traditional scenarios to sanction the states across their borders. And usually they do it to their geographically closest neighbors that are interlinked by very close ties with them. Especially it was very symptomatic for Russia in the 90s after the collapse of the Soviet Union, when most of these old production and value-added chains were still in place. And to our opinion, it shows a rely on immediate facts and a very tactical approach to sanctions, because it's widely proved on different examples that as for trade embargoes, you can mostly overcome their negative effects in 2-3 years, for some group of projects or goods for 1 year. So you can't make a bet to really keep the strong political effect, just keeping the embargo on grains for 20 years. It doesn't work. It can follow some symbolic goals, but not real political imperatives. And this hypothesis was also supported in most of the cases. But here we can be a bit confused by the question of capacities and intentions. On the other hand, neither Russia nor China have no opportunities to use financial system or technological markets as playground for sanctions. And it seems that even in the midterm period, it will be very hard to check, because China tries to push RMB as a sustainable exchange currency, and it will remain one of key imperatives of their regional policies. And if you want to promote some currencies as super stable, and next day you use it as a tool of your foreign policy, it's a pretty strong demotivator for other countries to rely on your solution. And the same with tax solutions. While China really compete for the place of one of key technological hubs of the world. The day he starts to use technologies as a weapon and manipulate with other players like European companies or American companies or Japanese companies who will be pretty happy to fulfill this gap. About this 5, to call it shortly, no gain, no aid, and this is what makes Western and non-Western policies pretty similar. As recently there were a set of claims by Donald Trump to cut aid programs for Pakistan and other countries. The same thing we see in Russian and Chinese practice. If we see a rising, not necessarily conflict, but a rising number of tensions between Russia or China and the countries they send aid, we see that the number of this aid or the scale of this aid really goes down. Not immediately, usually, because we had a series of tensions with Ukraine, and the number of special programs of cooperation and special conditions remain in place till the very, very late months even of 2018. And here is a very strong challenge in how to clearly define international aid, because we have OECD classification, but for example, the US also used its own classification that involves more aspects of international aid. Russia still has no clear classification of international aid. However, Russia remains a very important donor via United Nations programs and partially via their direct programs in Central Asia and other countries. And here we can go to a long debate on, for example, discounts for gas for Ukraine. Was it the form of international aid or it wasn't? According to OECD classification, of course, they weren't, but in some common sense explanation, it pretty seems like some sort of aid, and it was cut only recently. With China, it's pretty much the same. We know lots of cases where China uses special programs of social development in Africa, constructs hospitals, donates special money for exchange programs for education, but they are not necessarily calculated as an international aid because, for example, it's provided by private companies who work in the region and decide to build a hospital or to build or reconstruct a school. So this hypothesis also supports most of the cases, and here we see a pretty strong coincidence of non-Western and Western positions. Next steps that we try to develop regarding this data set is about more comparative evaluation of effects of sanction policies and probably of their efficiency. Probably because, to my opinion, when we go to the playground of the discussion, are sanctions an efficient instrument of foreign policy or inefficient, you also have to add some extra criteria related to what, compared to what, in which perspective, and even regarding US sanction tradition, we have brilliant studies by Bauer or Dan Dresner, but it's always the big chapter in in every book how some sanctions are considered as sanctions, why we consider them efficient, and why we consider other sanctions inefficient, and in other books it was done in another way. So, and it's for US sanctions that are mostly formal. And if we try to apply the same thing for Russian or Chinese sanctions that are usually informal, we go to a really dark forest, and that's why I think effects are more interesting and more achievable goal for comparison. As for evaluation of long-term effects of sanction policies, here again, it's interesting that despite US or Russia use different sanction policies and traditions and apply to different spheres of sanctioning, the result is pretty much the same. Either if we take a look on Iran or on Ukraine or on Georgia, even at their trade balance, where some sanctions are lifted or still are in place, we see the clear claim for diversification of their markets, of their suppliers, And even when part of Iranian sanctions under GCPOA were lifted by Europeans, in some areas European companies came back to Iranian market, but some industries and fields remain mostly controlled or interlinked to China, as China was the key partner and the strongest part, the toughest part of the sanction period. And regarding Russian-Georgian trade relations, when you now come to Georgia and you go just to an ordinary supermarket, you can see lots of Russian products there. That's pretty weird. For my opinion, Georgian milk is much better than Russian milk, but still, you can see lots of Russian suppliers there. But for example, even regarding wineries, and if you talk to wine producers now, they really have this Chinese dream, because once your wine is getting popular on the Chinese market and this area now is booming, you can ideally forget about any problems and the insecurities of Russian supplies to Russia. Will be they banned after new elections or they want, and rely on other suppliers. So here it seems that no matter what area is sanctioned, country will try to find either another supplier or market or currency to use. Going back to that first slide and this multilateral chess plays, I would like to focus on the second part of the title of the lecture, so on this multipolar world. So how the international system will influence on sanction policies and on sanction instruments that are used both by Western and non-Western states. First, future of sanctions. It seems that in mid-term period we will see more unilateral sanctions, and in a long term less, much less. Which are the key factors that I think are important to make this forecast? First, we see the rising vacuum of global approach or solutions for countries to mediate their interstate conflicts and tensions. And when you have this vacuum and you see that UN Security Council or other multilateral platforms are too weak to moderate the rising number of tensions, countries going back to pretty strong realpolitik, and sanctions seems to be a very good solution. Why they are? First, sanctions, especially since 2010, became very symbolic and still relatively cheap. And if we take a look on Russian or Chinese sanction practices that are related to trade restrictions, of course it creates some problem for importer of Georgian wine for a minute, for a pretty short time, and some businesses are ruined because of that solutions. But in general, related to total amounts of value of trade turnover of these countries, that is not too much. As we take a look on U.S. sanctions against Russia, we see that the turnover is miserable, related actually both to U.S. and to Russian trade turnover. And for American financial companies and financial market to lose Russian clients, probably it's not the best idea, but it's definitely not the real problem that can cause some dramatic challenges, or even to stimulate the group of lobbyists in Washington related, well, not let's please keep Russian financial sector open to us. It's nothing. And we see that even second-tier powers, they show the rising demand for sanctions, because to some extent it becomes, I would say, even prestigious to have a luxury to use these unilateral instruments of foreign policy and to claim that you're not just bargaining, but you impose sanctions on somebody, almost like UN Council. And the fourth factor is that we see the rising and more intense blending of sanctions that has to be purely defined as politically motivated steps with normal and classical trade wars of even of the 19th century style. And here we see the pure mix of notions. So political motivation or economic motivation is on the first, glance, and because that I think that it's related mostly to aggravation of rivalry between states when it's not now so clear where economic power starts, where political power ends. That's why we see this mismatch of notions. And for example, when we speak about Eurasian integration and discuss the problem of sanctions as a challenge for integration, at the same time, in the same phrase, you can see that, well, and also we will suffer from the rising trends for protectionism and trade wars. And here, this is completely different playgrounds, but actually they're united by the instruments, how they are applied, and it makes the situation actually very tricky, because if it's politically motivated, you have to explain why you withdraw your decision. If it's trade war, it's pure bargaining story, and you have any moral or political imperative to give any explanation except the rate of tariffs and gains in exports and imports. And as far as the international system becomes less stable, I would expect the rising number of that cases. The very recent case, I think it's to some extent it's funny, to the other extent it really represents the mixture of these four trends. In November 2018, so a few weeks ago, there was a set of news in Russian media, in Uzbek media, that Uzbekistan plans to impose sanctions on Ukraine. When I first saw it, I was like, what? Why Uzbekistan? Because like for 2 weeks there was only scandals about Russian sanctions over Ukraine, Ukrainian sanctions over Russia, and Uzbekistan is here, like, what? And then I started to go deeper into the case, and it turned that some Ukrainian auto producers and dealers raised the question that because of the low import duties on Uzbek cars, in cars produced in Uzbekistan, they lose some profits, and these import duties has to be increased. Immediately, Uzbekistan parliamentarians, they issued the idea that Uzbekistan has to impose import bans for sugar, sweets, butter, intense products, and some pharmaceuticals from Ukraine. So here we see a classical trade dispute and bargaining, but it was immediately shown off like Uzbekistan can impose sanctions. So this is the reality that we're gonna meet more and more. As for international environment, how it's gonna evaluate, the key character of this environment in a pretty soon period will be the situation that we see more options to compensate negative sanction effects. It can be achieved due to the set of factors. First, comprehensive diversification of international system. And well, here I use the word comprehensive, that is very popular in Chinese-led initiatives, but it really represents the trend, both for finance and technologies and trade. In finance, we will see more options to deal with different capital markets. We see more regional exchange platforms, stock exchange platforms, and, for example, insurance companies, and especially reinsurance companies, because you can see lots of insurance companies all over the world, but most of their policies are reinsured by 3 to 4 major global players that can handle that kind of risks. Currency swaps will already allow and will allow more and more to rely on different currencies in interstate trade operations. And to my opinion, it will be more, the whole trend on other currencies like RMB or Euro will be mostly limited by regular operations and trade operations, not as a saving option, because it will take much more time. But in perspective of 10 to 15 years, we will see at least plus 5 to 10% of that of global 5 to 10% of global trade will be supported by other currencies. New payment instruments and systems, here are lots of talks about the role of cryptocurrencies and blockchain technologies, about and their ability to invent new stakeholders and new participants in global payment systems and payment markets. I'm not an expert in that field, but I can just recapitulate that the whole story about cryptocurrencies are now getting very interconnected to minimization effects of sanctions and to broadly to hedging financial strategies of different players. As for technologies, first we already see and we will see more new solutions for quick and cheap localization of production capacities. So countries will get some options, not how to deal with trade embargoes and how to quickly balance their food security, for example, or energy security by new solutions like this 3D printing and vertical farms that are now getting very popular in Singapore. So countries that already meet the challenge of resource limitations without any sanctions, they do invest in that kind of technologies. New technological hubs and hubs for research and innovations. So the number of countries that can, or companies that can supply you some technologies you really need will increase. And the number of intermediaries will also increase, because if we take a look on the technological exchange map of 1970, you can find only 6 to 7 globally important R&D hubs. And if we look on the statistics of technological sanction cheaters, about 10 to 15 countries that were used to avoid technological sanctions, mostly in the Middle East. We can expect that the number of these intermediaries and techno hubs, so the countries who will be able to attract some technologies or become some intermediary platforms for some high-tech production, it also will increase. As for trade, that is the less interesting effect, but still popular. New trade routes, they already are developed, and this openly admitted that part of Belt and Road strategy relates to hedging trade routes that goes by the southern seas. Northern Sea route is a pretty cold hedging strategy and dark and with lots of ice, but still it's a very promising route in the Arctic. And again, new substitutes for traditional commodities. They are pretty important, and here we can speak about new renewables and energy, and water-intense goods, and again, this ideas for localization of production. So, what's after sanctions, when sanctions become less efficient or less popular? To my opinion, we'll see the decreasing number of effects of sanctions, and so less ruins, and due to diversification options, it will be less probable that particular unilateral sanctions will really cause a devastating effect on particular sanctioned economy. To be honest, if they really did without military support, because most of the cases when sanctions are considered as an efficient tool of foreign policy, they coincide with further military intervention that really cause a dramatic shift in political behavior of targeted countries. A permanent risk of sanctions decreases the level of trust. It's pretty obvious. And as we already see, it demotivates countries to launch joint long-term projects even when sanctions are lifted. And it means that it will open new windows for cooperation for countries who are not involved in the sanction practices and can represent themselves as a trusty partner. And it also will be interesting if we go back to this multilateral chess place. But in general, a decreased level of trust will lead to rising expenses for hedging. When you are sure that you have perfectly working SWIFT and you don't have to care about national payment systems and different currency swaps, like Russia now works on the currency swap with China, and it already takes so many efforts. And if you would like one day to have currency swaps with China, with Japan, with Korea, with Turkey, with Iran, it's really pretty heavy operational pressure, and this cost will probably increase and further. But in general, the international system we're going to see will become more dynamic, more mosaic, and less coherent. So that's probably it. And if you have any questions related to this research, please feel free to send them by mail or Facebook or whatsoever. Thank you. As Chris promised, we have time for discussion and questions. Please feel free to address them. Yes.
So thank you for coming to speak with us today. I had a question about earlier in your presentation when you mentioned the sanctions on Turkey and Russia and how they just kind of were taken away given the idea of the strategic relationship between Russia and Turkey. Do you think that internally part of the reasoning for taking away the sanctions resulted in the military arms deal between Russia and Turkey with the missiles that were purchased by Turkey and its leveraging against NATO, or do you think that was a separate discussion between the Russian and Turkish governments from the sanctions?
I'm pretty sure that it was part of the talks. Because, well, if it won't be, it should be a great mistake of Russian negotiators, and I don't think that they would follow it. And even by time, it mostly coincided that it was a few months maybe of this declaration. So I think it was discussed. Not necessarily right next day after the shut of the aircraft. Hey guys, you just shut our aircraft. We want to supply a system that can do it better. So it's pretty horrible. But in some period, I think it was a part of negotiations because we have very strong diplomatic links between countries, and they for sure were used. Yes.
Thank you for this. I'm an old student, but also I'm doing Ph.D. back in Japan, and my research theme is unilateral sanction from the point of international point of view. And regarding to that, the definition of sanctions, from international point of view, there's like several definitions. Actually, it supports that sanctions should be collective one, not unilateral ones. But at the same time, I don't think it is saying that only UN Security Council can impose the collective sanctions. So I'm confused with that. So if the international organizations can impose sanctions to member states, so it means that EU can impose sanctions to EU members but not to others. So do you think that is the differences between the interpretation of sanctions between Latin Americas and China, Russia, or all of them are thinking that Security Council is the only institution that can impose sanctions?
Well, actually, that's a very good question because it goes a bit deeper to this topic. When I said that UN Security Council can impose sanctions, it's mostly Russian and partially Chinese perspective because there was a case when General Assembly imposed sanctions, but it was done with no participation because it was impossible to do on the playground of UN Security Council. And if Russia or China will promote the idea that yes, we can also use the option of General Assembly, it means that that's discussing the tool that can be used against themselves. And regarding the point of the use of sanctions within the organization, it's pretty logical because it means that countries that participate in organization admits the fact that it can be sanctioned. But if we take a look at unilateral sanctions against Russia or Iran, it wasn't the part of some organization when they were imposed. And also there is a problem of very vague definition of the use of sanctions in the UN treaty. It's only, if I'm not mistaken, the few paragraphs on how they can be used, and there is no some convention, universal convention on sanctions or on unilateral sanctions or collective sanctions. So it's pretty open for speculations.
I'm Stephanie, I'm in first year math here. Going back to what you were talking about earlier about sanctions and them being efficient, I was just wondering if you can talk a little bit more about what makes a sanction efficient and how do you measure that in your research?
Well, actually, that's very difficult. That's why we don't measure efficiency. We try to at least properly estimate the effects of sanctions. And when we deal, for example, with trade embargoes, it's pretty easy to calculate, but it's not so easy to transform this trade evaluation to political effects. Sometimes it really coincided. It is pretty easy to say that the list of consecutive restrictive measures, in the end it turned in some change of political behavior. But it's pretty clear that it's not necessary. This is not isolated question of tomatoes or wines or cosmetics. That always the broader context of very tough or not tough, close trade relations between countries or broader interests, like in case with Turkey. So it's very difficult. If we try to evaluate each case like this, we can write a special research paper for every case, and it would be actually the proper way to trying to evaluate efficiency, but it looks like we need some methodology how to do that for the whole data set, and to the moment it seems either the way of simplification. So if for next 12 months some change of political behavior were observed, sanctions can be classified as an efficient instrument of foreign policy. But there's a very strong simplification, and I don't think that it will add some academic value to the research. We have lots of data sets when it's calculated like this, and then we have lots of critical papers that say that it's not the proper way to evaluate sanctions.
When you say that cryptocurrencies could be used or could potentially be used to kind of help minimize the effects of sanctions, has there been any documented Russian state interest in that, or this is just kind of speculation?
Russian state till last year had criminal sentence for the development of cryptocurrencies that was completely against the logic of minimization of effects and diversification of payment systems. Recently there is some shift because for Russian legislation the determinant of counter-terrorism measures was stronger than counter-sanction mechanisms. Now they try to balance it somehow, and also in Russia all this crypto industry and blockchain industry is booming because we see lots of young people really interested in some projects based on that, well, like everywhere. And they also know how to code properly, so they are very interested in it, and they try to find some balance between anti-terrorism legislation that is super strong and that's a very strong, this bloc represents very strong political leaders who are there, the Siloviki guys, the military guys, and it's hard to explain that, well, guys, there are other options, it's good for high-tech startups, etc. Guys, we have terrorism risks on the Caucasus, and they can use cryptocurrencies for anonymous payments. That's it. So I wouldn't say that Russia is champion here, but China is, and they invested lots of efforts in promotion of these technologies. So I think that they will do even a bigger progress here.
Have Russia or China ever imposed or threatened to impose secondary sanctions?
That wasn't on place, as I know, regarding at least the cases that we studied. That's clearly the point that is not supported by either official statement or informal talks. Secondary sanctions are not on demand and are not popular. First, because it's very hard to monitor them and to provide some clear justification on how they are conducted. And secondly, Russia really stays on the position that extraterritorial law is not accepted in law. Here, that's the joint position of formal and informal deals. Yeah.
This might be a little bit outside the scope of the research that you're conducting, but in the research that you have conducted, have you found that in Russia's case, considering that it's trying to build the Eurasian Economic Union, that sometimes instead of, say, a sanction being imposed, but providing the opposite in some instances to a state that it wants to join its union, which would give beneficial trade deals too? Have you found that the reverse has happened in order to encourage joining its economic union or to incentivize joining it, even if countries haven't yet? Or have you found that it's mostly been used just as a pressure point to leverage states in between, say, like the EU and American bloc, or between the East Asian bloc and the US and itself?
I didn't get probably the moment of particular Eurasian integration. Whether the use of sanctions like demotivate non-member states to join?
Yeah.
Well, I would say the problem is that demotivate member states to develop the integration. That's the bigger challenge for Eurasian Union at the moment. And the problem is that the Union is very young. It already has supranational Eurasian Commission that by mandate has to moderate that kind of tensions that are pretty normal in integration practice, but Commission has no enough competences and mandate to push five ministers from 5 member states to go to the table and elaborate one joint solution how to deal with sanctions. Probably it will, some kind of solution will appear, but it's clear that since 2014 to the moment there was no some particular solution, and it led to lots of small tensions and even loud tensions like between Russia and Belarus on imports of particular prohibited goods, the jokes about shrimps that now are produced in Belarus that have no any sea ports. That's a funny joke, but for integration for a very young united market, that's a problem because it leads that Russia tries to impose non-tariff barriers for the open flow of goods. Obviously, as a reaction, other member states don't want to support some the withdrawal of some other non-tariff barriers. So that's the long game, and that perfectly illustrates why unilateral actions are not the best, isn't the best support in joint integration processes. Yeah, Annie?
If just no question, in addition about sanctions, multilateral sanctions under United Nations chapter. So it's like it happens when there is a threat to peace, breach of peace, and act of aggression. It's under Article 41 of Chapter 7. In this case, like Security Council members adopt collective measures against wrongdoing state and impose some sanctions. So it's not mandatory that, for example, there were sanctions against Iraq in '91, I believe. So that these sanctions were Security Council sanctions under Chapter 7. So this is kind of legal framework how to impose sanctions according to United Nations Charter.
So that was the key point, because if in the presentation it says like people say this is the position of Russia and China because Russia and China has the veto power, but no, it is not, because Latin Americas are actually supporting this idea. So that was the argument in the presentation. But if the understanding of collective sanctions is different between Latin Americas and China and Russia, and that will be the
collective sanctions. It's when there is a kind of, let's say, use of force of one country against another country, and it's not it's wrong use of force. Like Iraq started a war against Kuwait in '91, right? So it's like kind of use of not legal use of force of one country against another country. So Security Council has this authority to make specific countries stop doing wrong things. So one of the measures is to impose sanctions. In this case, it was against Iraq, against Yugoslavia, etc.
Yeah.
So I don't know about South America sanctions.
Yeah.
Just about this.
because everything regarding to Security Council, you have to interpret between party with vetoes and party without vetoes. So if you say Security Council can impose the collective sanctions with good reason, that can be true, but with exceptions of permanent members, because they can use veto, right?
Mhm.
So that was,
I think that here the part of the puzzle is for Latin American countries the bet on only UN issued sanctions is part of some kind of hedging strategy. So if you stay in these positions, it's much easier to be against any really collectively supported sanctions, and it opens the floor for cooperation with countries that are under some unilateral sanctions, like Venezuela, for example, or some more equal.
I have a question about the, so if we have in a number of different countries increasing use of sanctions over time, or at least use, in the US, like there's good literature now on OFAC, and in the Treasury there's a group of people who are kind of sanctions bureaucrats, and they move up in the sanctions, kind of tracking the Treasury. In Russia and in China, it strikes me that you have the decision where about sanctions is made either in the political leadership or in the foreign ministry, but then it's executed somewhere else.
Yeah.
So are there people in like the Consumer Protection Agency in Russia or China who are like on the sanctions desk, even though it's called something else? Or do they just get the call from the foreign ministry and do
I
what
think
they say?
it's more the phone rule here, because I can't imagine that, well, they can suggest something, but only after the political initiative that we have to elaborate some measures, because even regarding counter-sanctions, usually it goes like we get the presidential order to allow to the government to elaborate a set of measures, and then it takes some short or not so short time to elaborate the list of measures, and so it's kind of intergovernmental work, and then it's issued as a purely a list of formal things that will be controlled by Ministry of Industry or this consumer protection agencies. So it's getting very, very instrumental. But the political mandate for the issue of the discussion on sanctions is always on the foreign policy interest background.
So is there similar to the US a sort of cadre of people, for example in Russia, who are sanctions experts?
You mean who are experts in imposing sanctions?
Yeah.
Well, there was a guy, Gennady Onishchenko. He was the long-lasting head of this
So but
structure.
he was like he wasn't put there to do sanctions, right? He was put there before
Well,
the
actually,
sanctions were-
this
or was it?
consumer protection agency, they does lots of other work, because we have 146 million market and of consumers, and they have lots of everyday routine.
Mhm.
And sanctions is the most like labeled part of their activities, but they have tons of other work to do. And sometimes even it becomes confusing when they issue some ban on some very particular good. And if this good is, for example, ridiculous, like there was a scandal when right before the ratification of the Treaty on Eurasian Economic Union in the end of 2014, there was a scandal like this Rospotrebnadzor imposed a ban on import of some Chinese produced lingeries to Russia. And it was the huge hype about the fact that they want to make everybody wear some ugly lingerie and not import anything. But then there was an investigation, it was a particular case of small party that was produced with the prohibition of any standards of light industry production. That's why it was banned. Well, there was nothing politics behind it. So that kind of case sometimes makes it really ridiculous. Think we're done? Please.
To make a point, I'm a MA student here at Fletcher. How do you think would work the sanctions against Russia, for example, because U.S. is willing to or has already imposed sanctions against, but some EU countries are dependent from gas energy from Russia. So in order to have, let's say, efficient sanctions against, and so we should have a collective approach. So
Yeah, sure.
Ugandans are dependent on them. So how do you think this?
Well, if we take a look on Iranian example, there are some cases when sanctions can be openly.
I mean, are there any ways into for the Ugandans to go along with the sanctions? I mean, like support this sanctions, because we have we've seen like Germany being hesitated of like imposing sanctions against Russia.
Well, if we take a case of Nord Stream 2 project, that is pretty huge. The idea that it can be just banned in a short term is pretty challenging for all arguments of energy security and some development plans for Germany and other countries. So I think that here we see less the problem of coalition, but more the playground for bargaining, because there is a mechanism of special licenses, of exemptions. So if both parties are interested in some dialogue, they can use different measures. In Iran by 2009, so before UN, the toughest UN resolutions, about 70 transnational companies, they operated under mechanisms of exemptions or special licenses, including, well, Schlumberger or other big companies. So I don't think that that's a very particular, some special case regarding European countries and their energy projects and energy interests, because US can't completely substitute immediately Russian supplies of gas. So I think there's some long-lasting bargaining for the future. I don't think that Germany will be really interested in following cuts in this situation, or at least it will bargain really heavily. It should. If I lived in Germany, I would bargain.
Any other questions? Great, well please join me again in thanking Anastasia for a very interesting discussion.
I think it's very symbolic that we ended on bargaining.